There are moments in life when everything becomes quiet, not because the world has stopped speaking, but because something deeper is trying to reach you. A whisper that doesn't compete with noise, yet somehow overpowers it. A pull that doesn't force you, yet refuses to leave you alone. And in that sacred stillness, you begin to realize this is not about the crowd, this is not about applause, this is not about fitting in. This is about you and me and no one else. Because there's a calling that cannot be shared with the masses. It is not designed for public validation. It does not thrive on popularity. It is deeply personal, intensely spiritual, and often misunderstood. It is the kind of calling that isolates before it elevates, that breaks before it builds, that empties you before it fills you. And the truth is, not everyone will understand what God is doing in your life. They will question your silence. They will misunderstand your distance. They will label your transformation as arrogance or confusion. But what they fail to see is that when God calls a person into deeper purpose, He often removes them from familiar places. Not to punish them, but to prepare them. Because what God is forming in you cannot be shaped in noise. It requires stillness. It requires surrender. It requires a level of obedience that goes beyond comfort and steps into trust. This is why the journey feels lonely at times. Because it is sacred. Because it is intentional. Because it is designed to strip away every distraction that competes with divine alignment. And in that process, you begin to see clearly who you are without the opinions of others, who you are without the pressure to perform, who you are when it is just you standing before God. This is where identity is refined. This is where purpose is awakened. This is where faith is no longer a concept, but a lifeline. And yes, it will cost you something. It may cost you relationships that were never meant to go where you're going. It may cost you comfort that was keeping you stagnant. It may cost you the version of yourself that was acceptable to others, but not aligned with your calling. But what you gain is clarity. You gain peace that cannot be explained. You gain strength that does not come from circumstances. You gain a connection with God that is no longer surface level, but deeply rooted in trust and obedience. Because when it becomes about you and God alone, something shifts. You stop seeking approval. You stop chasing validation. You stop shrinking to fit expectations. And you begin to walk boldly in what you were created for, even if no one else understands it. This is the place where faith becomes real. Not performative, not convenient, not conditional. Real faith is choosing God when it's uncomfortable. Real faith is trusting His voice over every other voice. Real faith is walking forward even when the path is unclear, simply because He said come. And understand this. God does not call everyone into the same assignment. Some are called to lead publicly, others are called to build quietly. Some are called to speak loudly, others are called to pray deeply. But every calling matters, and every calling requires surrender. So if you feel set apart, if you feel misunderstood, if you feel like your path doesn't make sense to others, don't rush to fix it. Don't dilute it to fit in. Don't abandon it just because it's hard. Lean into it, because this is not a mistake. This is not random. This is intentional. This is about you and God, shaping something eternal within you. This is about a calling that few will understand, but one that will define everything about your purpose. This is about stepping into a life that is not driven by fear, but anchored in faith. And when you fully embrace that, when you accept that it's not about everyone else, when you release the need to be understood, when you commit to the process, even when it's painful, you begin to walk in a dimension of purpose that cannot be shaken. Because when God has your yes, He doesn't need your perfection. He needs your obedience. He needs your trust. He needs your willingness to walk alone if necessary, knowing that you are never truly alone. So let them misunderstand. Let them question. Let them walk away if they must. Because what God is doing in you is sacred, and not everything sacred is meant to be explained. There's a moment in every calling where God begins to pull you away from what once felt normal, and it doesn't always feel holy at first. It can feel confusing, even painful, as if something is being taken from you rather than given. The conversations that once fulfilled you start to feel empty. The places that once brought comfort begin to feel unfamiliar. The people who once understood you now seem distant, as if you're no longer speaking the same language. And in that tension, you may question what is happening, wondering why everything that felt secure is slowly slipping out of your hands. But this is not loss in the way you think it is. This is not abandonment. This is alignment. Because when God calls you into something deeper, He cannot allow you to remain entangled in everything that keeps you shallow. What once fit your old season cannot carry your new assignment. And so, He begins the sacred process of separation, not to harm you, but to prepare you. Separation is never comfortable because it confronts your attachments. It reveals how much of your identity was tied to people, places, and routines rather than to Him. It exposes the subtle dependencies you didn't even realize were shaping your decisions. And as those things begin to fall away, it can feel like you're losing parts of yourself. But in reality, you're being stripped of everything that is not rooted in truth. God does not separate you to leave you empty. He separates you to fill you correctly. Because as long as your life is crowded with noise, His voice will always compete instead of lead. And God is not interested in competing for your attention. He desires to be your foundation. That is why He brings you into stillness. That is why He allows the silence. That is why He removes the constant validation of others, so that you can finally hear Him without interference. In this space, you begin to notice things you couldn't see before. You become aware of patterns that were holding you back. You start to recognize the difference between what is familiar and what is truly meant for you. And slowly, even though it feels uncomfortable, you begin to understand that this separation is intentional. It is here that your relationship with God shifts from something external to something deeply personal, no longer based on what others say about Him, but built on what you experience with Him. No longer dependent on being surrounded by people who affirm your faith, but anchored in a connection that remains even in solitude. This is the place where distractions lose their power, where the need for approval begins to fade, where you stop performing and start becoming. And even though it may feel lonely at times, there is a quiet strength forming within you, a strength that does not rely on circumstances, but on the certainty that God is doing something greater than what you can currently see. Because what feels like distance from everything else is actually closeness to Him. And in that closeness, He begins to realign your desires, reshape your thoughts, and redirect your path towards something that cannot be built in the presence of constant noise. There is a dimension of growth that only happens when no one is watching, when there is no applause to motivate you and no audience to affirm you. It is in this hidden place that God begins His deepest work, shaping you in ways that cannot be seen on the surface. And if you are not careful, you might misinterpret this season as stagnation, as if nothing is happening, as if you are being overlooked or left behind. But what feels like stillness is often the most active season of your transformation. Because God is not just preparing what people will see, He is preparing who you are when no one is looking. He is dealing with the internal before He ever reveals anything external. And this process is not rushed. It is intentional, detailed, and deeply personal. Every weakness, every insecurity, every hidden fear is brought into the light, not to shame you, but to heal you. In this hidden formation, God begins to dismantle false identities. The versions of yourself that were built on approval, performance, and survival start to lose their grip. You begin to realize how much of who you were was shaped by expectations rather than truth. And as those layers are stripped away, it can feel uncomfortable, even disorienting, because you're no longer able to rely on the things that once defined you. But this is where something real begins to take shape. God starts to rebuild your identity from the inside out, grounding it in something that cannot be shaken. He teaches you to find your worth in Him rather than in recognition. He shows you how to stand firm even when no one is validating your progress. He develops a faith that does not depend on visible results, but is anchored in trust. And this kind of faith is not formed overnight. It is built in moments where you choose obedience without understanding, where you continue to move forward even when there is no evidence that anything is changing. It is in the quiet prayers that no one hears, in the discipline that no one notices, in the decisions you make when it would be easier to give up. This hidden season also refines your character. It teaches patience when everything in you wants immediate answers. It builds resilience when the process feels longer than expected. It strengthens your ability to endure without losing hope. And slowly, without even realizing it, you are becoming someone who can carry more than you could before. What makes this season challenging is that there are no external markers of progress. You cannot measure it by achievements or recognition. It requires you to trust that something is happening even when you cannot see it. And that kind of trust stretches you, pushing you beyond the need for constant reassurance. But there is a purpose behind every unseen moment. Because if God were to elevate you without first forming you, the weight of what you carry would crush you. So he takes his time, building a foundation that can sustain what is coming. He works in the hidden so that when the time comes for you to be seen, you're not dependent on the visibility, but grounded in something deeper. Because what God forms in private is what sustains you in public. And the strength developed in these unseen moments becomes the very thing that allows you to stand firm when everything around you begins to shift. There comes a point in your journey where the call of God is no longer something you can admire from a distance, but something you must respond to with your life. And this is where everything becomes real, because obedience is no longer a concept. It becomes a decision that demands action. It is easy to feel inspired when the calling sounds beautiful, when the purpose feels meaningful, when the vision seems clear. But the weight of that calling is revealed in what it requires you to release. Because obedience will always cost you something. It will challenge your comfort, confront your fears, and stretch you beyond what feels safe. It will ask you to let go of what is familiar, even when it has been part of your life for years. It will require you to walk away from environments that once felt secure but no longer align with where God is leading you. And sometimes, the hardest part is not leaving things behind, but accepting that not everyone is meant to walk with you into your next season. There are relationships that cannot survive your obedience, not because they are bad, but because they are not aligned. And that realization can be painful. You may try to hold on, to explain, to make things work, but obedience does not negotiate with attachment. It calls you forward, even when your heart is pulling you backward. And in those moments, you are faced with a choice: cling to what is comfortable or step into what is calling you. This is where many people hesitate, not because they don't believe in the calling, but because they are not ready to pay the cost. But what you have to understand is that God never removes something without purpose. Every release is making room. Every closed door is redirecting you. Every moment of surrender is positioning you for something greater than what you are leaving behind. Even when you don't fully understand it, even when it doesn't make sense in the moment, there's a deeper plan unfolding. Obedience also requires trust at a level that goes beyond logic. It asks you to follow God's direction even when you cannot see the full path. It asks you to take steps without having all the answers. And that can feel uncomfortable, especially when you are used to controlling outcomes. But faith is not built on certainty. It is built on trust. In choosing obedience, you are choosing to believe that God's direction is better than your own understanding. You are choosing to prioritize His voice over your fears, His guidance over your doubts. And that choice, repeated over time, begins to transform you. It strengthens your faith, deepens your relationship with Him, and aligns your life with a purpose that is greater than your own desires. There's also a refining that happens through obedience. It exposes your motives, purifies your intentions, and reveals whether you're truly committed or simply interested. Because true obedience is not conditional. It does not depend on convenience or comfort. It remains steady even when the process is difficult, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the cost feels heavy. And in that place, where you continue to say yes despite the discomfort, despite the sacrifice, despite the unknown, you begin to experience a depth of connection with God that cannot be found any other way. There is a turning point in the journey where confusion begins to lose its grip, not because every question has been answered, but because your focus has shifted. You're no longer trying to make everything make sense to everyone around you. You're no longer measuring your life by comparison or waiting for approval to move forward. Something deeper has settled within you, a quiet certainty that does not need to be explained or defended. And in that place, purpose becomes clearer, not as a loud announcement, but as a steady direction that you cannot ignore. When it becomes truly about you and God, distractions begin to fade in importance. The opinions that once held weight start to lose their influence. The pressure to fit into expectations that were never meant for you begins to dissolve. You stop shrinking yourself to be accepted, and you stop expanding yourself just to impress. Instead, you begin to stand firmly in who you are becoming, even if that version of you is unfamiliar to others. This is where boldness is born, not from arrogance, but from alignment. Because when you know that your steps are ordered by God, you no longer need constant reassurance. You no longer hesitate at every decision, wondering what others will think. There's a confidence that grows within you, rooted not in your own strength, but in the understanding that you are walking in something divinely assigned. And this kind of purpose is unshakable, not because life becomes easy, but because your foundation has changed. Challenges still come. Uncertainty still appears, but they no longer have the power to derail you in the same way. Because your direction is no longer based on circumstances, it is anchored in something eternal. You begin to respond differently, to carry yourself differently, to move with a sense of clarity that cannot be easily disrupted. There's also a freedom that comes with this level of alignment. A freedom from a need to prove yourself. A freedom from the fear of being misunderstood. A freedom from the endless cycle of seeking validation. You realize that not everyone needs to understand your path for it to be right. Not everyone needs to agree with your decisions for them to be purposeful. And in releasing that need, you step into a level of peace that is not dependent on external affirmation. At this stage, your relationship with God is no longer something you rely on only in difficult moments. It becomes the center of everything. Your decisions, your thoughts, your actions all begin to flow from that connection. You're no longer reacting to life, you're being led through it. And even when you face moments of uncertainty, there's a trust that holds you steady, a knowing that you are not navigating this alone. Purpose also becomes less about what you achieve and more about how you walk. It is reflected in your obedience, in your consistency, in your willingness to remain aligned even when it is not convenient. It is seen in the way you carry peace in situations that once would have shaken you, in the way you remain grounded when everything around you feels unstable. And as you continue to walk in this, there's a quiet authority that begins to shape your presence. Not something forced, not something performed, but something that flows naturally from a life that is aligned with God. A strength that does not need to announce itself. A clarity that does not need constant confirmation. A purpose that stands firm regardless of who understands it or who does not.